Hello. We come to week 7, which is the book of Ezra. Um, in 2 weeks, I'll talk a little bit about why we're doing Ezra and Nehemiah here instead of Chronicles. But for now, let me say we're going to say a bit about Ezra and Nehemiah together as a pair, and then we'll take a look at the book of Ezra, and and then next week we'll take a look at the book of Nehemiah. I have to confess, because teachers should always lay their cards on the table, I have to confess a real liking for, I don't think you're supposed to have favorites with Scripture. You know, God gives Scripture to us. We don't sort of pass judgment on it. And by saying that, I say a lot about why I belong to the province of Christ the King. But anyway, I think you're just supposed to take it all. But I have a real liking for Ezra and Nehemiah. So it's fair for you to know that because, you can figure it in on what I say. We begin with our notes. We have some notes here that are marked Ezra and Nehemiah because, among other things, they have an outline which treats the two books together as a single one. And let's talk about that a little bit. Here, Harrison's very good introduction to the Old Testament. You can see how far we're getting along. We're up to the 1135th page before he gets to Ezra and Nehemiah. So there's been quite a bit of water over the bridge with Harrison. The rabbinic authorities and the Hebrew text. I just looked at a copy of the Hebrew text before this class, and the Hebrew text puts Ezra and Nehemiah together as a single work. It's clear from the way the Septuagint translation of Ezra and Nehemiah is presented that the translators of the Hebrew into the Greek were working with a copy that had Ezra and Nehemiah together as a single work. You may know that I'm up to 1136 now. The Masoretes were the traditional Jewish scribes in the 8 and 900s in Caesarea, Joppa, maybe in Palestine, who did things like the vowel pointing in the Hebrew text that we now use, the received text. That's why it's called the Masoretic text. They're the expert grammarians that the tradition comes from, and one of the things that the Masoretes did with the Hebrew text, because they were trying to, we talked about these difficulties of copying and stuff at the beginning of this class, I believe. One of the things they were trying to do was to protect the text and to try to make certain that when they produced a copy that they could check to see that their copy was accurate. And one of the ways they did that was for every book of the Bible, the Hebrew text, they counted the number of words and they counted the number of letters in the text, and then so they would know the total they needed. And then as they went through, they marked, I can't remember exactly, I know they marked halfway through and a quarter of the way through, but I think they marked down to the eighths. So I think as you go along, there's a marking for the eighth of the way through, and then a quarter, and then 3/8, and then half, and then 5/8, and then 3/4, and 7/8, and I think it's down to the eighths. I don't think they got down to the tens, but this is off the top of my head. I haven't thought about this in a long time. But anyway, what this allows you to do is to look at their text and see what they think is a book. And the Masoretic notations for Ezra and Nehemiah treat the pair of books as a single work. That much we know from the way the book is presented in the text. This is worth knowing because, for example, first of all, it's only possible to put Ezra and Nehemiah together because they're both quite short, so they can fit on a single scroll, right? We've talked about this before. The 2 weeks before this, we did Kings, and the book of Kings, which is a single work, has to be put onto 2 scrolls because it's so long. So we get 1st and 2nd Kings, right? Just like 1st and 2nd Samuel. But Ezra and Nehemiah are short enough so you can put them on a single papyrus scroll so they can be put together. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're considered a single thing. For example, the what we call the minor prophets, because they're short, they're small in size, not because they're small in importance. The minor prophets, the 12, right, are always bound together in Hebrew Bibles on a single scroll. But they're not considered to be a single work. They do talk about the 12 as a thing, hand me the 12 because it's a single scroll, right? So if you're reading from Amos in a synagogue, you say, hand me the 12, and they hand you the 12, and it's a scroll, and you have to find Amos. And so they're better on the order of the 12 than I am. Just a moment. I inadvertently left my glass of water outside. Okay. So you can tell, in other words, you can make a distinction even with things that are put together on the same scroll as to whether or not they're considered a single work or multiple works just put together for convenience. And these Ezra and Nehemiah are considered as a single work. It's interesting to know that. It's also interesting to know that the Syriac Bible, which, and Ezra and Nehemiah exist in Syriac. I have a Syriac Bible downstairs that has Ezra and Nehemiah in them, but the Syriac, it's printed by Western missionaries for use by the Syriac Church, and it contains things like the Book of Revelation, which the Syrian Christians don't actually read as a part of their Bible, and they also don't read, as this note says, Ezra and Nehemiah, First Esdras, which exists also as a separate work, and Second Esdras, which is an apocalypse. It's sort of an odd thing. All of these works, First and Second Esdras, are all easily available in. When I sent you the long list of works useful for Old Testament study, there is at least there are several collections in modern English now of apocryphal Old Testament works translated into English. One at least mostly by Christian scholars, one mostly by Jewish scholars, and one which has just begun. A single volume has appeared and they're working on. Some of these things don't completely lie over each other. The works that are available continue to grow. They keep finding things. But you can, if you want to read First Esdras or Second Esdras, you go to that book list and you can find these things. You may actually, because there are old translations of these things, you may be able to find First and Second Esdras online for free in English translations. But anyway, it's interesting to know that the Syriac Bible, which is generally the Syriac canon, is longer than the Western canon. For example, the Syriac canon contains the 151st Psalm, which our canon leaves out. It's interesting that they don't read Ezra and Nehemiah. I don't know why. I don't believe that anyone knows why. The Syriac church, being a Semitic language church, was very closely tied to the synagogue, much more heavily influenced by the practices of Judaism even than Western Christians, who are overwhelmingly influenced by the practice of Jews. And so it's very odd that the Hebrew text contains Ezra and Nehemiah. It does not contain Esdras, right? Ezra and Nehemiah, and the Syriac Bible does not. Sometime we could have an interesting discussion of varieties in canon, which are quite extensive sometimes. The different churches read sometimes quite different Bibles. It's important to note in passing that this does not make any difference in the church's theology as far as can be determined. Every time I mention that the Syrian Christians don't read Revelation, I always make certain to say to lay people who get nervous when they hear stuff like that this makes no distinction in their theology at all. The most important thing that comes from that fact, I think, is that if you're doing a Bible study on the book of Revelation, which all clergy fear, though they shouldn't. We did that in Washington, and it took forever. We got Father Starr and I got Father Livingston to do it. One of those things. I think we had a meeting when he wasn't there and elected him. But anyway, if you get people who are getting all worked up about the book of Revelation in your Bible study, you need to point out to them the fact that Christian churches that do not read Revelation have the same theology as Christian churches that do read Revelation. So if you sit down as a Christian and read Revelation and get all worked up and want to start changing what you believe, you're reading it wrong. Because we have 2,000 years of practice of doing it both ways, with Revelation, without Revelation, and you end up with the same thing. So the first thing everyone needs to learn if they're doing the book of Revelation in Bible study is to just everybody take a deep breath and relax. Nobody needs to panic about this. It's a very, well, again, you can't have favorites in the Bible. It's a very interesting work, but it's not teaching anything different than the rest of the New Testament teaches, so you just need to kind of calm down. Okay, so on 1140 here on this note, you will notice as you read through Ezra and Nehemiah that they contain in them documents written to and from the central authority in the Persian Empire, which is ruling Palestine at this time. And these documents that are contained in Ezra and Nehemiah fit very well with documents that have been discovered from document collections. It's worth knowing there is parts of these books are Aramaic. The documents are in Aramaic in Ezra. I took a look again. The book is Hebrew, but the documents are in Aramaic, which is actually historically accurate. The Persian Empire used what's called Imperial Aramaic as its administrative language. Just so you know, you can write Aramaic. Well, you can write any language in any writing system, right? But you can write Imperial Aramaic in Hebrew letters so it looks like Hebrew, right? Which is the way it's done in the Bible. But it's usually was written in cuneiform. I don't have any cuneiform to hold up for you, but I'm sure you know what cuneiform, because in fourth grade you had history and they talked about Hammurabi's code or something. It's all those little, looks like chickens walked across the clay. It's all that stuff. Cuneiform, it just means wedge-shaped writing. And most of the cuneiform documents, which are almost all in clay, though there's some on stone, most of the cuneiform documents that survive, I am told, I'm getting all this from, eating lunch with people who know what they're talking about, most of that stuff is actually Aramaic. There are languages that appear only in cuneiform documents, most famously Akkadian, Sumerian, and Hittite, right? And those are what people always call the cuneiform languages, because that's how we get them. But as a matter of fact, I am told the majority of the cuneiform material that has been discovered is actually Aramaic in language, because it comes from this later period when the Medes and the Persians were running their empire using the writing system that they discovered in the Fertile Crescent, which is cuneiform writing on clay, but using the general language of that Eastern Middle East that they were basing their empire in as foreigners moving in, which was Aramaic. Okay, remember that Abraham was a wandering Aramean, right? And he came from the eastern part of Mesopotamia. So that's all, just so you know. So what you're reading when you're reading a translation of Ezra and Nehemiah is there are actually two languages underlying this, not just one. It's a reminder of the fact that there are in the Bible three basic languages: Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. And there are words that come from a number of other languages as well. Paradise, for example, which is how Eden is described, is a Persian word, and there are, of course, Latin words like legion and centurion, right? So they're at least We've already discovered there now words from at least 5 languages in the Bible, and it's more than that. But anyway, just so you know. Okay. Um, so the documents that we see in this book are in the form of real documents that have been discovered separately, and the Aramaic that the documents are composed in is good Imperial Aramaic. Um, in other words, there is not on the surface of it a reason to doubt the historical accuracy of what we're being shown, right? As Harrison, being my kind of guy, a Bible guy, considers that you'd have to really want to think that the book of Ezra doesn't come from the period of the resettlement in order to conclude that the book of Ezra doesn't really come from the period of the resettlement. I mean, there are scholars around who conclude this because there are scholars around who don't want the Bible to be historical, but he thinks that you can't really come to that reasonably on a historical basis. We don't know, as he notes, we don't know why Ezra goes back to Mesopotamia, but if he's actually an official of the Persian Empire, which had an organized bureaucracy and moved people around the way you can get transferred if you're working for the American, federal government. You can get transferred, and he may have gotten transferred back. So we don't know. A very basic outline here at the bottom of the first page of notes. If you're just going to kind of slice it up into very few pieces, you get first Zerubbabel goes with a bunch of people to Jerusalem. And then you get the construction of the temple. Then you get another group of people going back to Jerusalem under Ezra, and you get the people being restored as a group. So there's sort of 2 phases and 2 leaders. Okay, it's perfectly clear, by the way, that the book of Ezra is a collection of stuff. Not only does it have documents in it that are clearly separate from the text, at least intended to look separate from the text, it also, like the book of Acts, has parts that are in the first person, I, and parts that are in the third person, he, and that clearly, those are clearly separate things, right? As Matthews and Moyer point out at the bottom of the page, Ezra, and you see this more clearly when we're going to look at Nehemiah next week, but Ezra's clearly closely connected to the temple. Ezra's family tree is given, and he's descended from Aaron, so he's a good Aaronic priest, and he's described as the priest Ezra, even though his professional training is as a scribe, right? So they want to send him because he's a scribe, he can communicate, and as I said before, the Persian Empire has a highly developed bureaucracy, and they want to send someone who is able to function in that bureaucracy, send letters and reports back and forth. We do not know if Ezra knew the cuneiform form of writing, but certainly if Ezra is trained as a scribe in this period, he would have been able to write both Hebrew and Aramaic, and he would have been able, for example, to write a document in Aramaic that someone who knew the cuneiform alphabet could then transform, not translate, transform into the cuneiform alphabet, and then it could be sent back to to the capital for some bureaucrat there to read and then file. And I do mean, strictly speaking, file. These organized early empires had libraries of documents that were filed according to an organized system like our libraries or our file cabinets are. And some of these things have been discovered. Of course, they've sort of collapsed, but they collapse the way bookshelves falling over collapse, so that things are not completely in random order. Things are kind of in order. And as a matter of fact, that's been very helpful for scholars who are trying to read this stuff. Just so you know, millions of cuneiform documents have been discovered. The number of people who can read them is extremely small. Most, even big universities, don't have a single scholar who works on cuneiform stuff. I had a roommate in graduate school who now teaches at a German university, classics, and he did Akkadian, Sumerian, and Hittite when we were in graduate school. And he said one of the reasons why he took them, this is at Harvard, which has got $36 billion, right? And he said, you got to take them all. I said, why are you taking 3 new languages the same year? And he said, I've got to take them all this year because this guy's just on loan for a couple of years and then he's going back, and Harvard won't have anyone who does this. I don't know if they have anyone now who does it, but though my father is a research scientist, I'd like to say that in between building whole new neighborhoods of science labs, which they are doing now in the city of Boston, it might be nice to fund a chair in Middle Eastern studies and have somebody who's work on this stuff. The reason I bring this up is that we know a certain amount about the Babylonians and the Hittites and those people. We'd know a whole lot more if all the things that had been discovered had been read. But the number of things that are discovered is so vast, and the number of people who can read them is so small, that there are whole floors of museums full of these things that nobody who can read them has ever looked at. It's going to be another couple of hundred years before even a big dent is made in them, let alone reading them all. That just, while I've got you, the same problem exists for medieval studies, which you wouldn't think would be true. That there are, I am told, more than 1 million medieval manuscripts that exist just in Western Europe, and almost none of them have been read by modern scholarly eyes. So when people like me say, oh, we just did early Christian doctrine, and we've lost some of the early works of St. Augustine, I say, what a tragedy. Of course, there may be 40 copies of them out there, but they're in these medieval manuscripts that nobody's read yet. So we need to have people reading Latin stuff too. So if there's anyone out there who's looking for a second career, let me commend to you either cuneiform studies or medieval studies as something to do that's worthwhile. Even if you are the greatest scholar in the world, you'll never be able to buy yourself new shoes, but you'll be doing good work. Okay, so we're at the top of the second page of notes. The relationship between Ezra and Nehemiah, as was noted before, is unclear. We don't know exactly the narrative of events that go along with the resettlement. So the usual thing, because all of the copies of Ezra and Nehemiah of which I am aware are Ezra and Nehemiah, Ezra first and then Nehemiah. Everyone always talks of them that way, and that can lead us to think Ezra must be earlier, first, and then Nehemiah second. We don't actually know that. And it's worth reminding ourselves of the fact that we don't actually know that. Same thing here at the top of page 2. The beginning of the book seems to continue Chronicles. At least you can read it that way. So that you would think that first you read Chronicles and then you go right into Ezra. So people think that Chronicles is already written and Ezra and Nehemiah are consciously written to come after them. Certainly Chronicles does cover an earlier period than Ezra and Nehemiah, but the truth is we do not know how those documents relate to each other. One reason, as a matter of fact, for doing Chronicles last is to try to shake you out of I don't want to give you the impression that I think Ezra, Nehemiah, and then, that Chronicles comes and then Ezra and Nehemiah, which a lot of scholars would argue. I think we don't know, so by treating Chronicles last, I'm trying to make you think about where they actually belong. Okay. It is interesting. Keep in mind what we see. We're going to go through the book in a minute. We need to look at what we see Ezra do and then look at what we see Nehemiah do. They do not seem to be performing the same function. They do not seem to be occupying the same position. Exactly what positions they were occupying, how organized it was, how this relates to how other parts of the empire were run, we don't really know. We talked about this a little bit before in passing with things like Daniel. Um, the biblical books that deal with the Persian and Babylonian Empire seem clearly to be produced by people who knew something about how those empires worked. But we do know some basic things. We do know that those empires, like the Roman Empire, um, were very flexible and they ruled different parts of their territory in very different ways. So it's possible that what we're being shown about Palestine is completely historically accurate and yet quite different from the way that empire is functioning in other parts of its territory. We just don't know. I believe that how these empires worked is one of the things that scholars of this period are working on. I've read a little bit of the stuff that exists, and it doesn't seem as though they know very much in detail about how these empires worked. Um, and just as a note, you'd think we'd know everything about how the Roman Empire worked, and even though we even have books of laws from the Roman Empire, we don't actually know very much about how the Roman Empire actually functioned. People argue about it quite a lot. There's a certain amount of information, but because we don't know where the information we do have fits in the overall picture, it's very hard to use that information as much as we could if we had broader knowledge base to work with. Okay. It does seem to be fair to say, as Matthews and Moyer do on page 266, that um, the book seems to be trying to show Ezra as an enforcer of the law of Moses, which is why it ends with the kind of putting away of the foreign wives, which to us seems very different than it seemed to them. That seems to be to end on a note of harking back to the good old days when people obeyed the law and the covenant. Okay. Satterthwaite and McConville, I included those little notes because I'm always interested to know how people date things, and they're quite eager to date things. Ezra 1 through 6 is in the 530s through the 5 teens, and then 7 through 10 they think is in the middle of the 5th century BC. Which would be quite interesting, of course. Then the book of Ezra would cover a period of some 80 years. Certainly possible. Whether or not that's completely trustworthy, I don't really know enough to know. Anyway, here's this outline at the bottom of 2 and the top of 3. I got this out of the New Jerusalem Bible. If you want to do a Bible study on Ezra and Nehemiah, you can blow this up big on one page and give them this. It has the great benefit of being small scale enough so it can help you find where things are. If you look at this, you've got Cyrus and Zerubbabel and the cornerstone and Samaritans and the scribal activity, situation in Jerusalem, right? Then you get Nehemiah, the report from Susa, the disaster in Jerusalem. Nehemiah asks to be sent, building the wall, how they divide up the task, celebrating their completion, stuff like that. Promulgating the law. More on that next week. But it's and then of course the gathering of people into Jerusalem at the top of page 3. And I note again at the end, the great difficulty with this is this assumes that Ezra and Nehemiah is the proper historical order, and we just do not know that. And because we do not know that, we should never use that picture as the basis to make further decisions, right? Since Ezra talks about an earlier period than Nehemiah, therefore, just can't say that. Okay, it's difficult to deny yourself that. I mean, this is I think one of the great failings of scripture scholars. They cannot resist theorizing about something and then building on their theories so that you end up getting 4 and 5 layers away from what you actually know. This is how you end up with Bible timelines. all of which are fine as well as we know, but they're not dependable because we can't demonstrate them. Let's look, so that's halfway through. We have half an hour. Let's go through the book of Ezra, see what it contains. It's short enough for us to do that. We'll do the next thing. We'll do it next week with Nehemiah. Let me say, to begin with, these are books where the maps and pictures that are offered in the ESV Study Bible I find particularly useful. I have tried, as I talked to you a couple of weeks ago, you cannot get the illustrations from the ESV Study Bible. They're not available online, even if you have the code to get into their website and everything. Which I did everything I know how to do, which is not much, but all they offer you is text and notes online. So the only way to get this material is to buy the ESV Study Bible. It's actually quite inexpensive. It is the one that we suggest, following Father Smith, for people to get. I'm reading it this year, so I'm in the midst of the Gospel of Matthew. Jesus has just arrived in Jerusalem, and I wonder what's going to happen. And so I would urge you to buy this study Bible. It's a very good one. And it does help if everyone uses the same. It has, as I said at the beginning of this class, I believe, the great disadvantage of not including the Apocrypha, even though the ESV translates the Apocrypha. I own an ESV with the Apocrypha in it. So they did, of course, it would be even more of a doorstop than it is now. And they'd have to hire some, evangelicals don't like to hire people to work on the Apocrypha. So they'd have to hire some probably Catholic people to work on the Apocrypha, maybe even Eastern Orthodox, double right? And they didn't want to do that. So we don't have the Apocrypha in this book. Okay, so now let's just go through the text and see what we can see. In the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled. Interesting that it's keyed at the beginning to a prophet. The Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia. Just as a note, if you remember the Branch Davidians being massacred by, I don't want to be unfair, especially before an election, but it was under the first President Clinton. The leader of that group called himself David Koresh, and he was referring to himself as God's Gentile anointed in the tradition of Cyrus, who's also God's Gentile anointed. Cyrus gets a very good press in the Jewish tradition because he sends the people back to their homeland and supports the rebuilding of the temple. So this is why this is where you get David Koresh. Koresh is, Hebrew version of Cyrus. Okay, so he sends, he makes a proclamation to all of his kingdom, and here's the proclamation, which is saying that he's going to send back his people to rebuild the house of God. If you look at this, right, whoever is among you, among all his people, may his God be with him. Verse 3, let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, rebuild the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. Let each survivor in whatever place he sojourns be assisted so they can go and take offerings for the house of God that's in Jerusalem. This is presented as Cyrus sending Jews back to Jerusalem to worship the Lord there. Cyrus, like a lot of these empires, and this is one of your questions, short answer questions, Cyrus thinks his empire would be better if all gods in the empire were worshipped appropriately, that is, the way those gods wanted to be worshipped. The Lord in Jerusalem clearly wants to be worshipped by Jews in a temple there. Cyrus sends back the temple equipment, as much of it as survives, and he sends back Jews, and he's even willing to, because he knows that they have a hereditary priesthood, stuff all which pagans would have understood, or Zoroastrians in this case, a hereditary priesthood, and he sends back everything necessary for the proper traditional worship of the Lord, not because Cyrus is a worshiper of the Lord, But because these empires, for a number of different reasons as far as we can tell, thought it best if all of the peoples in their empire were allowed to worship their own gods in the way that they wanted. First of all, they had a vague pagan idea that deities were in charge of certain places, and that every place had gods or goddesses that were particularly in charge of it. And if you were going to operate in that place, you wanted to be on their good side. So if the Lord's in charge in Jerusalem, and Jerusalem's a part of your empire, you want to be on the Lord's good side. You don't want the Lord mad at you. So Cyrus would send, support to the temple of the Lord. Not that he's ever going to go there or thinks particularly about the Lord, but that's the way their empire operates. The Romans were very much the same way. Okay. So in verse 5, the heads of the fathers' houses of Judah and Benjamin, the priests and the Levites, get all set to go, and they collect materials and they bring out the temple equipment, verse 7, and all of this equipment here that's listed, and also value in verses 9 and 10. And so they send the exiles back. Sheshbazzar, the prince of Israel, right? These are the people, for chapter 2, of the province who came up out of captivity, of those exiles whom Nebuchadnezzar had carried captive to Babylon. And you get lists of people. And then you get countings. You get numbers of men in at the end of verse 2. Then in verse 40, in verse 36 you get priests. In verse 40 you get Levites. In verse 55 you get the sons of Solomon's servants, which is interesting because that would allow the kind of recreation of a civil bureaucracy, right? And notice how they talk about Solomon's servants. That's interesting. Of course, Solomon is the last king of the United Kingdom. So it shows what period they think they're going to recreate or reawaken when they go back. They're not going to go back and have a divided kingdom again. First of all, there's going to be no king because they've got Cyrus, right? But they're going to go back and have an organized people worshiping the Lord centered on Jerusalem in the proper way, the David-Solomon way, not the split kingdom way. Okay, that's why they're Solomon's servants, not Jehoshaphat's servants. Okay. And they tell you where they're from, and altogether, verse 64, they're 42,360. I've said before, I think that I'm willing to take Bible numbers as being more or less, but I just treat Bible numbers as almost all symbolic. I can't remember if I've talked to you all about this. Numbers in Hebrew are very clumsy, and they don't really have they don't have a system of, we have separate symbols for numbers, and we can, recount them very carefully. Our culture uses numbers differently than their culture did. They wrote numbers out, and it's very easy to mix them up. And if you look at the texts, Bible texts, the numbers get all mixed up. You can't push the text that way, I think. So when people want to fight with you, the Bible's clearly false because look at these numbers. I mean, Methuselah's too old, stuff like that. First of all, there's more going on there than just that. But also, I just think you can't treat Bible numbers the way we treat numbers. That's a mistake in interpretation to do that, culturally and practically and every other way. So I don't get too fussed about these numbers. Though if they say they've got 1,200 men and another group has 128, then I think the 128 group is smaller than the 1,200 group, and that's about as far as I'm willing to go. Okay. Now, rebuilding the altar. So they get back, and at the end of the second chapter, they're back, and what's the first thing they do? They rebuild the altar, not the temple, but the altar, right? When the 7th month came, the children of Israel were in the towns, and the people gathered as one man to Jerusalem. Up comes this guy, Jeshua, who's a priest, and Zerubbabel with his kinsmen, representing the royal family, presumably. They build the altar of the God of Israel, and they offer burnt offerings. as it is written in the law of Moses, the man of God. Verse 2. So they're doing it properly, right? If there's anything you took away from the books of 1st and 2nd Kings, it is that there are lots of ways to worship the Lord that are improper, and there are ways to worship other gods that are even worse, right? So just because they offer burnt offerings doesn't mean they're doing the right thing, right? And the people who are writing this, whoever writes this, is perfectly aware of that. He says, as it's written in the law of Moses, the man of God. First of all, it shows that they've got a book, which is written. You know, how many books it is, we don't know. But they are following the written law, and it's the law of Moses. They're doing proper worship. That's what they're trying to tell you. So that's important. You notice, look, verse 3, they set the altar in its place. Okay? It would have been perfectly clear where the temple went. This is about 70 years after the destruction of Jerusalem. They knew very well the way things were organized. It's within a single human lifetime. So they would have been hearing from their parents how things looked in Jerusalem. And when you get back, if you have some of these pictures to look at, you can see very clearly that Jerusalem is a city which is built on artificial platforms to make the hills flatter and the building easier. It's perfectly easy, just like the Temple Mount today, which is a flat platform that the Muslims have put mosques on. The platform is artificial, and it's easy to see where the temple used to be on that platform. If Israel had the political will, they could knock down the mosques and rebuild the temple. It's perfectly easy to do. You just have to be willing to have your aid from the U.S. cut off, and they're not willing to do that. And also they're waiting for the Messiah to take them back to Jerusalem. So that's an internal political problem. They missed that boat. Okay. So they kept Sukkoth, the Feast of Booths, verse 4 in chapter 3, and they keep on going. Now after that, in the second year, in verse 8, they start working on the temple. Zerubbabel and Jeshua, the same guys, civil and religious authorities, get together, and they appoint Levites to do the organization, and then the builders begin in verse 10. And all, they're starting to rebuild the temple. And as soon as that gets well underway, the people give a great shout, and then you get adversaries in chapter 4. When we've seen very clearly, the text is very clear, when the Babylonians take the children of Israel into exile, the land is not left empty. They move in. First of all, they don't take everybody. And second of all, they move in other people to occupy the land. There's no point in having an empire if nobody lives in it, right? The reason you have an empire is so you can tax the people who live in it. That's where you get your money from, right? If there's one thing we know in Washington, it's that everything comes down to making people pay taxes. And the Babylonians were smart enough, so they moved people in to occupy the land so they can grow things and the government can take their cut. That's how governments work. Okay? So there are people around when people come back from Babylon to rebuild the temple, and they have got, they've been there 3 generations, 70 years, and they've got things all set up so the people in charge are in charge, and people in charge don't like other people in charge, like Zerubbabel and Jeshua coming back in and having connections with the political authorities, throwing their weight around and making the local authorities less important. So they get resistance, right? So they hear that the returned exiles are building the temple. They approach him and they say, let us come in. We'll worship your God together with you. We've been sacrificing, this is verse 2 in chapter 4. We have been sacrificing to him ever since the days of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, who brought us here. So they are non-Jewish people brought in, and they've been sacrificing to the local gods, they say, on the principle that I talked about, that you always want to have the local gods on your side. So since they were doing some kind of pagan rite, we presume, because they wouldn't have been informed Jews, they're from elsewhere, they were doing some kind of pagan rites in honor of the local deity, just the way pagans would always do. Of course, this is a nightmare for the Jews. You have nothing to do with us. Go away, right? They get, and so there's hostility, and they write an accusation here to King Artaxerxes, um, talking about who's in charge there, and they're asking, they're rebuilding this city that rebelled against you before, and we're just writing to let you know because we're good subject. We're loyal subjects, and they're setting up a city that could be the center of revolt again, the way the old city was. So we good people are letting the king know. So the king responds, right? I heard the letter read to me, which is interesting. I'm sure that's how they did it. People read stuff to the king. He didn't. This is small potatoes for the Assyrian Empire. I think some kid just out of the Kennedy School of Government in Babylon, his first little job as as a lower level bureaucrat, he was the guy who had to read these letters. But in the name of the king, he responds. I don't think the king is messing with, but of course he responds, in the name of the king. That's how kings do stuff. He, he responds as if he were the king. So, but it's not impossible that Artaxerxes is interested in this stuff and does it himself. But I don't think we should assume too much personal interest on the part of Artaxerxes, because after all, he's got a lot of people to run. He's got 100 million people in his empire, and the however many thousand Jews he just sent back 42,000 Jews don't really swing a lot of weight. Okay, so then they get he says we're gonna it's been found that well, he says, okay, we're going to make a decree that these people hold up on the work until I check it out, because this is a different king from Cyrus, right? This is Artaxerxes now, who is busy fighting with the Greeks. And so you get Haggai and Zechariah prophesying there, two of the later minor prophets, and Zerubbabel and Jeshua again, and they're still going round and round. And so Tattenai, the governor of the province beyond the river is what this slice between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean is, one area, borders on Egypt. So it's a military governor who's there because he's worried about what's going on in Egypt. The Babylonians actually at times control Egypt, but it's always an area of concern for them. So there's someone who's there watching it, and this is this guy Tattenai, and they send him a report. And here's the report in chapter 5, beginning at verse 7. To Darius the king, all peace, and so forth. Telling the story of the previous exile and how Cyrus had previously made a decree that these people should return. So just to make sure that this is all right, take a check in the archives. I mentioned before that we know that as a matter of fact, the Persian Empire had a series of different archives that have been even discovered that tend to deal with different parts of the empire. So Darius here in chapter 6, they search in Babylon and in where the archives are stored, and in Ecbatana, the citadel in Media, which is another archive closer. Media is more in Asia Minor, closer to where Palestine is. They do find a record of Cyrus's decree. It's interesting. We see a little bit about how organized the empire is. They don't have the decree kept centrally. The decree is kept in an archive closer to the part of the empire that it deals with. The emperors did travel around from place to place, reviewing the empire and checking on people. And so it's possible that Cyrus even gave the decree. Cyrus himself is from Asia Minor. It's possible that Cyrus, what would you say, promulgated the decree while he was in Ecbatana rather than in Babylon. But anyway, okay, so they check it all out, and they respond that they should let the work continue. Verse 7 in chapter 6, let the work on this house of God alone. Let the governor of the Jews and the elders of the Jews rebuild this house of God on the site. Remember, this is still all about the temple. This is a quarrel about whether or not the Jews are allowed to rebuild the temple and begin the organized traditional worship of the Lord in its appointed place, appointed by the Lord in the Jewish tradition. Okay, that's what this fight is about. It is because they're talking to secular authorities. The people who object say we're worried because this could lead to a rebellion, right? Just that should turn your mind to the Sadducees in Jerusalem under the Romans going to Pontius Pilate and saying, this guy, they don't say this guy's a prophet and we disagree with his message, right? They say this guy is making himself the king of the Jews and he is a threat to the rule of Rome because he's claiming to be the local king, so you want to get rid of him. And then Pilate, questions him, are you really the king of the Jews? And Jesus doesn't seem interested in that, so Pilate says, I don't have a problem with this guy. Prophets are no problem for the Roman Empire. If he's going to start a revolution, that's one thing. But if he's arguing with you about how to interpret the books of Moses, then don't bother me, right? It's worth noting that similar situations, that is, foreign non-Jewish overlord, people fighting about what's allowed to go on in Jerusalem, the local people who are trying to get the big power involved use the same tactics. Okay? All right. So they finish and dedicate the temple here in 13 of 6, right? According to the word sent by Darius the king. They do with all diligence what he ordered, and they built it and prospered, and there's Haggai and Zechariah again, and they finish the building, and they celebrate the dedication of the house with joy. Verse 16, they offer at the dedication all these animals. We don't often think how bloody the sacrifices were. It has been correctly said that being one of the Levites doing the heavy lifting in the temple is much more like working in a big scale meat packing business than anything else. There are hundreds and hundreds of carcasses to deal with all the time. A lot of washing down things. You'll notice they throw the blood around a lot, and they don't seem to wash the blood. At least we're not told. They do wash things before they do offerings with the sea that Solomon built, but they don't. There's not a lot of talk about washing off the altar and stuff, and so things would be crusted over with dried blood and stuff. It's difficult for us to imagine, but this is the reality of what's going on. So you need to picture that. Just as a note, Muslims still do bloody sacrifice. Of the 3 Abrahamic religions, they're the only ones that still do bloody sacrifice. Jews, theoretically, if the Messiah comes back, will do bloody sacrifice again, though a lot of American Jews would have real cultural trouble with that. Sorry about the lighting. I can't make it work right. Okay, so they celebrate the Passover in verse 19, and that's very exciting because it's the first time back in Jerusalem, and they eat it, and then Ezra comes to teach the people. Okay, so here now comes book of Ezra, calling the book Ezra, and it's called Ezra in the Hebrew collection. It's very interesting because, of course, more than half the book has gone by and Ezra hasn't shown up yet. Right? Here comes Ezra, 7, 8, 9, and 10. He's only there for 4 chapters. But anyway, here comes Ezra, the son of Shariah. This is verse 1, son of Sariah, all the way down to son of Aaron, the chief priest. He's from Babylonia. He's a scribe skilled in the law of Moses. And so he's a two-tool player. He's got both the law and the worship. So up they go to Jerusalem, and Ezra's going to get everything organized, right? And so Ezra comes with a letter that Artaxerxes gives him, which starts in verse 12 of chapter 7. And he wants them to. It's very interesting. This is where he allows them to make use of government funding to support the worship. And okay, how is this responded to by the book? This is beginning in verse 27 of chapter 7. Blessed be the Lord, the God of our fathers, who put such a thing as this into the heart of the king, to beautify the house of the Lord that is in Jerusalem. They realize that all of this is part of God's taking care of the children of Israel. So, if they're going to set up Israel, still, this is a worshiping entity, right? Ezra's is bringing knowledge of the law, and he's a good Aaronic priest. He's going to be in charge of this operation. What do? These are the heads of their fathers. I gathered leading men from Israel to go up with me, says I is Ezra. So we've changed to the first person. The beginning of 8, these are the heads of their fathers' houses, and you get genealogy, right? In this case, it seems quite clear. One of the reasons you get genealogy is they're trying to show you, as we'll see in the rest of the book, that they are making certain that the people that they refound Israel with are actually Jews, right? Are actually descendants of the 12 tribes. Okay, so he gathers them together and they camp there, and then they fast for protection in verse 21, and they guard. They're carrying a lot of treasure, which they're going to need for setting this whole thing up. So they go along here in verse 31, and they set off on their journey, and beginning of chapter 9, the officials approach me and want to, organize who's actually going to be a member, right? They have taken some of their daughters to be wives for themselves and for their sons, so the holy race has mixed itself. They greet him with the news that people have intermarried with, non-Jews, and so there's some difficulty about them functioning as proper worshipers of the Lord. Okay, so he's this is now you get Ezra's response. He's ashamed and blushes in verse 6. What are we going to do? So the people praise, and the people pray, and they get Ezra to pray here in 10. They confess their sins for marrying, the women of the local people, and of course also in Babylon. And they all gather together, and the last scene is here. Beginning in verse 9 of chapter 10, all the men of Judah and Benjamin. Remember, those are the group that they started with at the very beginning. It was Judah and Benjamin. They come together in 3 days. It's the 9th day, and they sit in the open square. Ezra stands up and addresses them and says, we got to make this right. So they select people in verse 16 who are going to check to see, who's appropriately done it. And you get lists of priests who married foreign women, and of Levites who married foreign women, and of Israel who married foreign women. And that's the final scene. They're separating out those who are eligible for involvement in the cultic worship of the Lord and those who are not. So the book ends with this separating. And as one of our things in the notes said before, that's a high point, because by confessing that this is going on and being willing to be separated out, the children of Israel are demonstrating that they are willing to do what is necessary in order to make themselves appropriate worshipers of the Lord, which is to overthrow the way their lives have been led up till now, send away their wives and children. Separate question as to how we view this. And there's no talk of conversion either, which is interesting. But send away their wives and children to make themselves appropriate worshipers of the Lord. Next week we get Nehemiah, and we see a very different picture about this same process. I'm glad that we were able to go through the text. There's a lot in there, and of course there's a lot that we could struggle with in great detail. But just to give you a sense of how it works, we're already over time, but let me just say before I let you go, Ezra is completely centered on the temple and what is necessary in order to function in the temple. Nehemiah is not, and we will look at Nehemiah next week. Thank you for your patience.